Hello, class, and welcome to Social Psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and this week we will be exploring a little bit of prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. Now, these are really powerful social phenomena that touch nearly every aspect of our society. They shape how we interact, how we perceive ourselves, how we interact with others, and influence countless areas and aspects of life, from our workplace to our schools to our communities, as well as media. So, to kind of get us started, I'd like you to just take a moment and reflect on where you may encounter prejudice or stereotypes or discrimination in your own life. You may notice examples in media or in politics or maybe in your everyday interactions. So I just want you to consider how these biases shape interactions and even influence expectations or behaviors towards particular groups or individuals. I want you to think about a moment as well where you may have observed or even felt judgments based upon factors like your race or your gender or your age or your social status. Because today we're going to be exploring those constructs from a psychological perspective. What drives people to adopt biases? How are these attitudes and behaviors formed? And more importantly, how can they be addressed and changed to make a more fair and just society? So, I want to kind of give you a little bit of an outline of today's lecture. As always, I want to start by telling you a little story about an important figure in social psychology, and then we'll dive into some of the intricacies of prejudice and discrimination. And we'll start out with the nature and origins of prejudice by looking at some of the affective and cognitive and behavioral components of these biases and try to understand them as distinct yet interconnected phenomena. There's a subtle difference between each of them. And then we'll look at what's the impact, what are the consequences of these biases when an individual or society gets caught in them. And so we'll look at the cognitive and behavioral effects, including things like stereotype threat and self-fulfilling prophecies, as well as the emotional and psychological toll of experiencing discrimination. And then finally, we will dive into what can we do about prejudice and discrimination. We'll explore social psychology interventions, such as the contact hypothesis and the cooperative learning strategies, and what we can do for empathy building exercises that can help to reduce a bias and stereotyping and prejudice and discrimination. So that's a little bit of our outline for our lecture. And as always, I like to start by introducing an important figure in the field of social psychology, and one of the most influential figures in understanding prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination is, of course, that giant Gordon Allport. He was born in 1897 and died tragically in 1967. And he's really an American psychologist that has pioneered several areas of psychology, including personality psychology as well as social psychology. Now, Allport's contributions to the field are really numerous, but probably he is best known, and this is something that you'll want to know for several quizzes, is his most important book, which is called The Nature of Prejudice, written in 1954, which explores the complexities of prejudice and provides one of the earliest comprehensive analyses of what prejudice is. And Allport argued that prejudice stems from a universal human tendency to categorize, which can lead to biases that favor in-groups that is the group that we identify with, over outgroups those that we see as different. And he introduced that whole concept of in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination, which frames that whole key social dynamic that flows into the development of prejudice. Now, another major contribution of Allport is the contact hypothesis, which really suggests that intergroup contact under appropriate conditions can reduce prejudice. If you are interacting with people that you identify as other groups, but you meet as equals and you interact with them as equals and work together towards common goals and work in cooperation and all find institutional support, what ends up happening is that prejudice is done away with. And this hypothesis then becomes a cornerstone in social psychology and really kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of interventions aimed at reducing prejudice in diverse settings, including schools and workshops. And so I wanted to give some thought to how can we use this idea of the contact hypothesis in our own school, in our own community, and in our own sphere of influence. Now, let's take a little bit of time as we dive into the formal part of the lecture by defining some of these key terms. Now, when we think in terms of prejudice, we're really referring to a negative attitude or a feeling toward individuals based solely on their membership with a particular group. It is visceral, it is affective, it is emotional, but it's still a bias. And it's often rooted in fear and dislike and hostility. So, for example, feeling distrust or dislike towards someone because of their race or gender or religion is a form of prejudice. And then there's stereotyping. Stereotyping is another component, but it's a cognitive component, whereas prejudice is an attitude or feeling. And stereotyping involves overgeneralization about a group that is applied to an individual or a group, and the stereotype can either be a positive or a negative. Sometimes it can be neutral, but it's basically an overgeneralization, and therefore it is often inaccurate. So, for example, assuming that all individuals from a certain nationality possess the same characteristics is a form of stereotyping. And finally, we have discrimination. And discrimination is that behavioral manifestation, whereas prejudice is the affective side and stereotyping is the cognitive side. Discrimination is the behavioral side, the manifestation of this bias. And so it occurs when individuals are treated unfairly or unjustly based upon their group membership. And so discriminatory actions can range from social exclusion and unequal access to resources, to unequal access to resources, and even at overt action of aggression. So, for example, refusing to hire someone because of their age or gender is discrimination. And while prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination are interconnected, they are distinct in function and influence. So, prejudice is an emotional response, stereotyping is a cognitive process, and discrimination is an action. And these phenomena can operate independently, but often they reinforce one another, leading to a cycle of bias. So, for example, a person may feel prejudice, that is, the negative feelings toward a group. They may hold stereotypes or beliefs about that group and ultimately act in a discriminatory manner towards its members. And this distinction is crucial in social psychology because interventions to reduce these biases need to address each separate component. And that's why we talk about the subtle differences between the emotional side, the cognitive side, and the behavioral sides of these biases. Because each one of them requires a different strategy, such as empathy building for prejudice, or education for reducing stereotypes, and policy to prevent discriminatory actions. Now, understanding the origins of prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination really requires exploring some of the psychological and social mechanisms behind these biases. So I want to take a little bit of time and explore some of the theories that help us explain why these biases develop, and highlight really how the people we grow up around, our family, our culture, the media that we engage with, all kind of play a role here. The first one I want to kind of start off with is the idea of Albert Bandura's, that we catch basically and we reflect what we see or what we observe. So according to social learning theory, prejudice and stereotypes are often learned through observation and through modeling. And so people, especially children, absorb attitudes and behaviors from those around them, such as family members and peers and media, often unconsciously adopting the biases they observe. So, for example, if children see their parents or peers demonstrating prejudice, they are more likely to internalize similar attitudes. And the media also plays a significant role by portraying certain groups in stereotypical or negative ways, which can reinforce societal biases. And studies have shown that both direct instruction and observational learning can powerfully shape attitudes towards different groups. Then we can look in terms of cognitive theories, and here we can think in terms of Tafel and Turner or Gordon Allport, that whole idea of we automatically, cognitively categorize information to simplify the complex world around us. We might do this unintentionally, but it's going to lead to stereotyping. And this categorization process includes sorting people into in-groups, those that we feel similar to, and out-groups, those that we see as different. And so there's always going to be, because of the emotional structure that ties in with cognitive thinking, there's always going to be some groups that we favor and others that we don't. And in order to overcome that, we need to be aware of that. So the whole a real example of the overgeneralization of cognitive bias is the out-group homogeneity effect, that basically leads people to perceive members of all of the out-groups as more alike than they actually are. And this reinforces the overgeneralization stereotypes that often go on with the thinking process. And then we can look in terms of a psychodynamic or personality theory perspective on this, and look at some of the traits that are associated with higher levels of prejudice. So, for example, authoritarian personality theory, developed in the 1950s, suggests that people with a strict adherence to authority, rigid thinking, and a tendency towards conformism may be more susceptible to prejudice. And these individuals often see the world as an us versus them mentality, leading to stronger in-group loyalties and demands for in-group cohesion and a prejudice against out-groups. And so social dominance orientation, which is another relevant concept, refers to a personality trait associated with a preference for hierarchy and dominance over lower status groups. So basically, you want to be in a place of power and of social dominance, and so that's inevitably going to come out as expressed in discriminatory attitudes that marginalized groups that are viewed as inferior or subordinate. So those are three key ways of kind of looking at the origins of this kind of bias that builds into prejudice and discrimination and stereotyping. So there are also, so when we kind of just look specifically at prejudice now, we want to kind of look at different ways that we can kind of break this down. So biases takes various forms and can operate both consciously and unconsciously. And so I want to kind of just explore that a little bit. First off, we can have the explicit versus implicit bias. And when we talk about that, we're really kind of talking about, with explicit, we're talking about conscious beliefs and attitudes. So like, for example, an individual with explicit bias are often aware of their prejudice, and these biases are typically expressed openly through statements or actions. So, for example, openly admitting to disliking a particular ethnicity or a particular group is a form of explicit bias. But then there's also implicit bias, which refers to unconscious associations or attitudes towards a group, where an individual may not even be aware that they hold this. And these biases often emerge automatically and influence behavior subtly. Now, there's been some research in the 1990s that led to something called the implicit association test, which reveals that implicit biases are common, far more common than we might realize. And these will inevitably affect decision-making, even among those who consciously believe in equality. Then there is contemporary forms of prejudice. There's, first off, aversive racism. And this type of prejudice exists in individuals who believe that they're not prejudiced, but still hold unconscious negative feelings or biases. So aversive racists may avoid interactions with certain groups or act in ways that unintentionally disadvantage them. So this will often then they'll just explain away their behaviors as a way to kind of maintain their own self-image of, I'm not racist, I'm not prejudiced. Then there's something called symbolic racism or modern racism, which is really kind of rooted in the belief that minorities violate traditional values like hard work and self-reliance. And this form of prejudice is really kind of subtle, and it's expressed as opposition to policies or practices intended to promote equality, such as affirmative action. And you can probably see it quite a bit in the media nowadays, particularly in terms of certain statements towards immigrants from Latin America, for example. Then there's benevolent sexism. And benevolent sexism is seemingly positive, but inherently has a patronizing attitude that suggests women are gentle and need protection. Now, this is different from hostile sexism, which overtly denigrates women, but benevolent sexism places women in stereotyped roles that limit their independence. And again, this is something that we should be mindful of. And of course, there is the idea of intersectionality. And intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s and early 1990s is kind of when it kind of took off. And intersectionality really kind of addresses how different aspects of a person's identity, such as race and gender and sexuality, all intersect to create unique experiences of prejudice. So intersectionality posits really that prejudice and discrimination cannot be fully understood without considering all of these overlapping attitudes. So, for instance, a black woman may experience biases related to both her race and gender, shaping her experience differently than someone who faces bias based on only one of these characteristics. And so studies have shown that intersectional discrimination can amplify disadvantages and complicate some of the social challenges that many individuals face. Now, we can all probably recognize that prejudice is very multifaceted, but I also want to kind of explore stereotyping, because stereotyping is important to kind of really understand as well. Because stereotyping has some real significant effects on an individual and on society, and really kind of shapes how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive others and how then that people behave. And the cognitive behavioral impacts of stereotyping are really kind of profound. And there's a couple of things that I want to kind of be mindful of here. One is known as stereotype threat, and the other one is the self-fulfilling prophecy. So first off, when we look at the cognitive and behavioral consequences of stereotyping, it really kind of affects how we process information. When people encounter someone with from a stereotyped group, they may interpret that person's behavior through a lens of preconceived beliefs, leading to biased perceptions. And stereotyping influences memory as well. People are more likely to remember information that confirms a stereotype and forget information that contradicts it, reinforcing biased beliefs. And these cognitive consequences can manifest behaviorally, as people may act in ways that align with or enforce stereotypes, thereby perpetuating them. Then there is the concept, and this is important because you're definitely going to be tested on this. What is stereotype threat? Well, it's a concept that was developed by Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson back in the 1990s, which describes the anxiety that an individual feels when they fear confirming a negative stereotype about their group. So this fear can undermine their performance, particularly in high-stakes situations. So, for example, research shows that women and some minorities may perform worse on tasks like math tests when they are reminded of stereotypes that suggest that they're less capable in these areas. And so stereotype threat not only impacts performance, but it then erodes the person's self-esteem, their self-efficacy, and their motivation over time. And then there's the self-fulfilling prophecy. And the self-fulfilling prophecy occurs when an expectation about a person or group influences interactions in ways that cause that expectation to come true. So, for example, if teachers hold lower expectations for certain groups, they may provide less encouragement or fewer resources, leading to lower achievement among these students. And this phenomenon was famously demonstrated by Rosenthal and Jacobson back in the late 1960s, which found that when teachers were led to believe that certain students would improve academically, those students actually did see greater gains, likely due to the increased support that they were given and the positive interactions that they received. Now, I want to explore a little bit of the idea of group dynamics. And we've talked about this lots, but the idea of in-groups and out-groups and how belonging to an in-group makes you feel favored, and out-group bias leads to discrimination, prejudice. And within this is the idea of social identity theory. Henry Tafel and John Turner back in the late 1970s had that social identity theory, which posits that people derive a significant portion of their self-esteem from their group memberships. This might be their nationality or their religion or even their sports team. So according to this theory, individuals seek positive social identities by favoring their own groups, their in-groups, and sometimes viewing other groups, the out-groups, less favorably. And this in-group, out-group dynamic can then lead to prejudice and discrimination, especially when people feel that their group is superior or at odds with others. And then there's the in-group favoritism, out-group homogeneity. And the in-group favoritism really kind of refers to the tendency to view members of one's own group more positively, often providing them with that preferential treatment. And the out-group homogeneity is that tendency to perceive members of the out-group as being much more similar than they actually are. And so they kind of get lost in this amorphous single stereotype where they're bad, they're lazy, they're whatever. And we don't look at the subtleties and the cultural differences between them. And in doing these biases of in-group favoritism and out-group homogeneity, we lose a lot of the shared attitudes and values and importance of what it means to be human. And that is the real tragedy here, is that in trying to make a community for ourselves, we are making our world smaller and more divided. And then there's the realistic conflict theory that was first introduced by Muzaffar Sharif in the 1960s, where he suggested that competition over limited resources like the jobs or status or land can lead to this intergroup hostility. And the theory is famously demonstrated in Sharif's Robber's Cave experiment, where boys in true groups develop negative attitudes and behaviors toward each other when they competed in various activities. However, when the groups had to work together to achieve common goals, all of that hostility went away. And so this theory highlights how economic and social competition can exacerbate the in-group, out-group bias and can lead to prejudice and discrimination, but how when you work together, things can be so much better. And you just kind of recognize that people are people, and we need to treat each other with love and fairness and recognize that there are going to be some differences between people based upon background, but that doesn't make them any less valuable as people. Now, we all live and move and breathe within culture, and we all are consumers of media. So these things are going to influence us. And there's a couple of ways that this can happen. First off is the cultural transmission of different stereotypes. So cultural values and customs often reinforce stereotypes by establishing norms around particular behaviors or roles or characteristics associated with specific groups. And these stereotypes are passed down through generations and become socialized within families and with educational institutions and even religious organizations. So, for example, traditional gender roles that position men as breadwinners and women as caregivers are cultural norms that influence stereotypes around work, competence, and authority. And so studies indicate that societal norms significantly impact individuals' perceptions of what is appropriate for different groups, thereby reinforcing the biases. And then when we look at media, because media is such a powerful influence, we need to recognize that it transmits these stereotypes. Studies have shown, for example, that when you portray groups in movies, in television, and news advertising, it influences societal attitudes. So, for example, the overrepresentation of African American men as criminals in the media contributes to the association of this group with crime, while the underrepresentation of women in leadership roles may reinforce the stereotype that they are somehow less capable in these positions. So positive portrayals can challenge stereotypes, but research has shown that many media representations still adhere to stereotypical and often harmful depictions of race and age or other kind of identities. And I want you to just kind of think about this in terms of something like advertising. Advertising, oftentimes employs stereotypical imagery. A woman as a homemaker or minorities in subordinate groups, which subtly influences public perception as to what is normal or what is desirable. Movies and television shows go a long way to changing or reinforcing these stereotypes, and we need to kind of be mindful of that as we go forward. And that's part of the reason why I think it's very important for all of us to, if we have that kind of leaning to work in media, to work in ways that can make for a better and more fair and more just society. Now, I want to kind of have you think in terms of the consequences of discrimination. First off, there's the individual impact of discrimination. There is obviously, it's something that you're going to live with stress and anxiety and depression and low self-esteem. And research shows that repeated exposure to discriminatory treatment can erode an individual's sense of self-worth and negatively impact their overall health. So, for instance, discrimination in the workplace, such as being overlooked for a promotion based upon some group dynamic, can lead to a sense of inadequacy or a feeling of hopelessness. It can have real health consequences. Chronic stress is a great example of that, and that causes health problems, including things like cardiovascular disease and weight gain. Then there's the systemic impact of discrimination, where the haves get more and the have-nots get less. And this kind of discrimination, when it's tied in with something like hiring practices, for example, leads to income inequality and other discriminatory policies like limiting access to education or getting a difference in achievement gaps between groups. And this disparity is often exacerbated by discrimination, which disproportionately affects marginalized communities, creating generational cycles of disadvantaged peoples. And of course, then there's the long-term effects of discrimination that can shape the life of entire communities. And longitudinal studies have shown that individuals who experience discrimination early on in life may face challenges in their personal development, in their academic achievement, and career advancement. And so sometimes, if you find that you are caught in that kind of situation in a certain community, sometimes it's good to go somewhere far, far away from that community. And in so doing, you discover that all of the messages that you were being given were wrong. That you are of value, that you are gifted, that you do have an impact. And that can transform the intergenerational impact that would eventually be there if you were caught in that continual cycle. So it's important to kind of be mindful of that as you work and move and live with the consequences of discrimination. Now, how can we reduce prejudice? What kinds of interventions can we have? Well, reducing prejudice and fostering inclusivity is really something that's at the core of psychology, and there's several effective interventions that have been developed to address this. The first one is something I've already talked about, the whole idea of the contact hypothesis, promoted by Gordon Allport, where under certain conditions, intergroup contact can be reduced. And so the theory puts forward this, that meaningful interactions between groups, when it's structured that all the groups are equal and that they cooperate together and that they have common goals and they have institutional support, this can lead to greater understanding and reduced stereotypes. And so research on this hypothesis, so for example, Pettigrew and Top did a meta-analysis in the early 2000s, showed that intergroup contact is really truly effective in reducing prejudice across a wide range of settings, whether that be schools or workplaces. So for example, integrated classrooms that promote cooperative learning can reduce racial and ethnic biases among students. Then there's the idea of cooperative learning and common goals. And one successful application of the contact hypothesis is the jigsaw classroom approach. And this is something that was put forward by Elliot Aronson. And the idea here is that students work together in mixed groups, where each person contributes uniquely to achieve a shared goal. And this setup fosters positive independence as students learn to appreciate each other's strengths. And then they can gain a sense of equal standing. Studies have shown that jigsaw classrooms not only reduce prejudice, but also promote empathy and cooperation and academic engagement. And finally, there's another approach to reducing prejudice, and that is the idea of perspective taking. That is putting yourself in the other person's shoes, and empathy building, which is basically feeling what the other person feels. When you encourage someone to imagine themselves in the position of someone else from a different group, all of a sudden, it sounds simple, but all of a sudden, it starts to promote reducing negative stereotypes and promoting positive attitudes towards outgroups. And the simple perspective-taking exercise can lead to some less automatic stereotyping and more compassionate behaviors. And it's part of simply building those skills of empathy, of perspective-taking. Because really, what is prejudice and discrimination but lazy thinking, lazy feeling, and lazy policies? So when we learn to exercise these muscles and to recognize that there is indeed value and diversity, and that it's worthwhile to work towards understanding these things, then we can go a long ways to reducing prejudice. Now, what can we do in institutions in order to do this? Well, there's a couple of different things that we can do. First off, we can do something called implicit bias training, which really kind of aims at raising awareness of some of the unconscious biases and provide individuals with strategies to counter them. So, for example, training people in the workplace or in schools or in law enforcement to recognize their own biases, and then to introduce tools like mindfulness, like perspective taking, like slowing down your decision-making process. You are developing the skills and the ways of thinking that a person needs in order to reduce biased attitudes in the short term. And this will have a snowball effect in the long term, where behaviors will begin to change. Training may raise awareness, though, but without some ongoing reinforcement and some systemic change, the implicit biases are still going to persist. And so there needs to be some supports to this. And that's where we get into the idea of policy interventions. So when we see policies that are discriminatory, we should change them. So when we can incorporate things like affirmative action and anti-discrimination laws and inclusive hiring practice, we are showing effectiveness in promoting diversity and reducing disparities. And so anti-discrimination laws in hiring and housing can improve access for historically marginalized groups. And policy interventions are also more sustainable over time as they create institutional accountability and hold individuals or organizations responsible for fair practices. Now, there are some limitations and criticisms of this, though. People don't change overnight. This is a huge process. It takes time, it takes lifetimes, it takes generations, it takes entire lifetimes of nations to do so. But in doing that, we can reap some real rewards. Now, there are some critics of implicit bias training that argue that it may be ineffective if treated as a one-off. Fair enough. There needs to be reinforcement. We need to develop habits because we can't always. There's a reason why people default to biases, because it's easier. And you can't always have all the energy that you need to be working through problems. But when you recognize that and change your automatic short-term thinking structure to some extent, that's going to go a long ways to helping with some of these biases. And then recognizing that sometimes we need to slow down and change the ways that we think, then that also is going to help. Now, I want to kind of just explore one very interesting case in history. And this landmark case really kind of demonstrates some themes of prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination and how to overcome it. And it's called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka in Topeka, Kansas. And this kind of dates back to 1954, so it's quite a while ago. But this is a U.S. Supreme Court case that declared that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. And so this fundamentally challenged that whole practice of separate but equal that had allowed discrimination to flourish in education. And so a little bit about the Brown versus Board of Education case is that segregation meant that black and white students attended separate schools. And this prevailing belief was that these separate facilities could be equal in quality, although in practice, schools with black children were often underfunded and lacked resources. And so the case was brought by the NAACP on behalf of several black families, and they argued that segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so the Supreme Court agreed that the separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And there's some lessons to be found here. First off, that by segregating schools, it reinforced that negative stereotypes, implying that black children were inferior and unfit for education alongside white children. The Brown decision also acknowledged the psychological effects of segregation as described in what is called the famous doll experiments, conducted by some psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark. And what they did is they showed that black children in segregated schools often internalize these negative stereotypes. And so when they wanted to play with a doll, they wanted to play with a white doll over a black one because there was more positive associative traits with white dolls. And I've had some of my students say that as well. And this contributes to a damaged self-concept. and highlights how stereotyping and discrimination can impact mental well-being. And this case also exemplifies the role of policy interventions in addressing discrimination. Now, although the Brown ruling was a significant step towards dismantling systemic discrimination, I think we can all agree that the process of desegregation required a lot of different laws and didn't cure the problem of prejudice by any stretch of the imagination. But what it does do is it shows how prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination operate in both the individual and on the systemic level, and how policy change combined with awareness of psychological impacts can begin to dismantle this inequality within a person's life. So, just to kind of close out our lecture, I'd like to highlight 3 key terms. Be mindful of these terms because they may be important in your quizzes. The first one is the idea of implicit bias, which is the unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in really kind of an unintentional way. And this is very much unlike explicit biases, which are deliberate and conscious. So implicit biases are automatic. They're short-term, and they can influence behaviors without us even realizing it. Then there's the idea of stereotype threat, and guaranteed this one's going to be on a quiz. And this is the anxiety or concern that is experienced by people who fear that they're going to confirm a negative stereotype about their group. And so this concept was developed by Steele and Aronson, and really highlights how awareness of stereotype can really kind of undermine someone's performance, particularly in high-stakes situations. And then there's social identity theory, and I've talked about Henry Tafel and John Turner before. They posited that people derive part of their self-esteem from their group membership, whether that be their tribe, whether that be their sports team, whether that be their nation, whether that be their religious group, whatever it might be. This contributes to their sense of well-being, but it also contributes to a bias against outgroups. And this, too, contributes to prejudice and discrimination. So, here's a question. This will definitely be on a quiz. Which of the following statements best describes the concept of stereothreat? Well, I would suggest that stereotype threat is the anxiety experienced when individuals fear that they may confirm a negative stereotype about their group. Now, last thing, I just want you to remember that prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination are very complex, multifaceted, and they always impact not only the individual, but society at large. And so whatever we can do to understand the origins, effects, and ultimately intervene against those, we are helping ourselves, we're helping our community, we're helping our family, we're helping our nation to overcome the biases and foster more inclusive communities. So remember, reducing prejudice is a dynamic process that involves both personal awareness and systemic change. And by continuing to challenge our own biases and advocating for fair practices, each of us plays a role in promoting equity and understanding in our social environments. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thank you very much, and I will see you in our next lecture. You take care. Bye-bye.